It's Friday, the 27th of January, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Sean Curran. On the programme this week...
He can't say when the prison system will keep streets safe again. He can't even deal with tax avoiders in his own cabinet. Is he starting to wonder if this job is just too big for him?
The difference between him and me is that I stand by my values and my principles, even when it is difficult.
Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer clash over probation service failings and the tax affairs of the Tory chairman. Heated questions for Nicola Sturgeon in the Scottish Parliament over the presence of a transgender rapist at a female prison.
Violent criminals, just like the sex offender, the absolute beast we are discussing today, would try to exploit loopholes in the law and attack and traumatise women.
There is no automatic right for any trans woman to serve their sentence in a female prison. That is subject to robust risk assessment.
Questions in the Commons after it emerges that 200 children are missing from hotels housing asylum seekers.
A whistleblower has reported to have said, children are literally being picked up from outside the building, disappearing and not being found. They are being taken from the street by traffickers.
I've not been presented with evidence that that has happened, but I will continue to make inquiries.
The Church of England's refusal to allow bishops to perform same-sex marriages prompts emotional testimonies from MPs.
You've fallen in love with somebody from your own sex, and the place that you devoted your life to and your God is that church, and that's the place where you can't get married.
Let's start here at Westminster with Sean Curran. Sean, at Prime Minister's questions this week, Rishi Sunak was challenged over failings over the probation service by the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer, and it comes after a report which found that mistakes were made by staff, which meant a man with a history of violence was able to sexually assault and murder law graduate Zara Alina last year. What did Keir Starmer say?
Yes, this was a very sombre start to Prime Minister's questions from the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Last June, a man called Jordan McSweeney, who had been out of prison for just 9 days, murdered Zara Alina as she walked home from a night out. McSweeney has been given a life sentence. The government ordered an inquiry. The probation's watchdog for England and Wales produced a damning report which set out a series of mistakes that had been made. McSweeney should have been categorised as a high risk, and he wasn't. And the report also set out that there had been opportunities to recall him into custody that had been missed. So a very grim report. There was a statement on Tuesday from a Justice Minister about the report. But the very next day, Sir Keir Starmer decided to raise the issue directly with the Prime Minister. And he quoted Zara Alina's family, who have said they think that ministers and the probation service have blood on their hands.
Zara Alina was walking home from a night out with her friends when she was savagely attacked, assaulted and beaten to death. Zara was a brilliant young woman, a trainee lawyer with a bright future. Her killer is a violent, racist, woman-hating thug, not fit to walk the same streets. No. But that's precisely the problem. He was free to walk the same streets. Yeah. The inspectorate report into her case says that opportunities were missed by the probation service that could have prevented this attack and saved her life. Does the Prime Minister accept those findings?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, this was a truly terrible crime. And as the Chief Inspector has found, the failings in this case, and indeed others, were serious and indeed unacceptable. In both of the cases that are in the public domain, these failures can be traced to failings in the initial risk assessment, and that's why immediate steps are being taken to address the serious issues raised.
Across the country, probation services are failing. After a botched, then reversed privatisation, after a decade of underinvestment, it's yet another vital public service on its knees after 13 years of Tory government. I spoke to Zara's family this morning. It's hard to convey to this House the agony that they've been through. They say that the government has blood on their hands over these failings. He's accepted the findings of the report. Does he also accept what Zara's family say?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my heart, of course, goes out to Zara's family. He mentioned accountability. The probation services has taken action where failings have been found and where that has been appropriate. One of the other things we must remember, Mr. Speaker, if we do want to increase the safety of women and girls out on our streets, that we need tough sentencing. And that's why this government passed the Police Crime and Sentencing Act, which the honourable gentleman opposite and his party opposed.
Now, Rishi Sunak's also under pressure over his party chairman, Nadeem Zahawi, and his tax affairs, particularly now that we know Nadeem Zahawi paid a substantial penalty to HMRC, the tax authorities, over unpaid tax owing from when he was appointed Chancellor by Boris Johnson. What happened at Prime Minister's Questions?
Yes. Now, we should say we often try to predict what the Labour leader will go on at Prime Minister's Questions, and he did take us a little bit by surprise by talking about the probation service there in that very serious case, because we had all been expecting him to talk about Nadeem Zahawi, and they obviously did get onto this. So there were very angry and noisy exchanges in the Commons, in part because last week at Prime Minister's Questions, Rishi Sunak told MPs that the Minister, Nadeem Zahawi, had addressed this matter in full, only for a few days later Mr Sunak to order an investigation by the Independent's ethics advisor to see whether Nadeem Zahawi had broken the ministerial code, and this was after it had been confirmed that Mr Zahawi had paid this tax penalty.
So more things have come to light.
More things had come to light since Rishi Sunak gave what seemed to be a very clear statement last week in Prime Minister's Questions. So there was a lot for the Labour leader to go on. Now, we should stress that Mr Zahawi, who's a minister in the government, insists that he has acted properly. He wasn't in the chamber, he wasn't in the Commons yesterday, but it did give rise to some pretty angry, bad-tempered and pretty personal exchanges.
Does the Prime Minister agree that any politician who seeks to avoid the taxes they owe in this country is not fit to be in charge of taxpayer money?
With regard to the appointment of the Minister without portfolio, the usual appointments process was followed. No issues were raised with me when he was appointed to his current role. And since I commented on this matter last week, more information has come forward. And that is why I have asked the independent advisor to look into the matter.
His failure to sack him when the whole country can see what's going on shows how hopelessly weak he is. A Prime Minister overseeing chaos, overwhelmed at every turn. He can't say when ambulances will get to heart attack victims again. He can't say when the prison system will keep streets safe again. He can't even deal with tax avoiders in his own cabinet. Is he starting to wonder if this job is just too big for him?
Mr. Speaker, the difference between him and me is that I stand by my values and my principles even when it is difficult. When I disagreed fundamentally with the previous Prime Minister, I resigned from the government. But for four long years, he sat next to the member for Islington North. When anti-Semitism ran rife when his predecessor sided with our opponents. That's what's weak, Mr. Speaker. He has no principles and just petty politics.
Let's be clear about this. This is now a matter of the Prime Minister's own integrity and accountability. After all, when there was questions about the Home Secretary, the Secretary, and concerns about her role in relation to national security, he chose to back her. Now the chair of the Tory party, he's choosing to back him despite a £5 million penalty from HMRC. And of course, he's seeking to protect the former Prime Minister despite his cosy financial relationship with the chair of the BBC. Is it little wonder that people in Scotland may well just consider the Tory party to be a parcel of rogues?
Mr. Speaker, what I'm standing up for is proper due process. That's why we have an independent advisor. It's right that the independent advisor conducts his investigation. That's how we will ensure accountability, and that's what I will deliver.
No, it's not the only row, of course, facing the Conservative Party and the government right now, because the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been back in the headlines after it was claimed that the BBC chairman, Richard Sharp, helped secure a loan guarantee for Boris Johnson to the tune of £800,000, not long before he was recommended for the job as BBC chairman by Boris Johnson. What is the story here?
Yes, so Richard Sharp is the chairman of the BBC. That's a government appointment. He had been an advisor to the government, and what he says happened is that he had told senior officials in the government that he knew somebody who was in fact a distant cousin of Boris Johnson who was willing to help Mr. Johnson with his finances. Mr. Sharp says that was the extent of his involvement. And yes, this did all happen just shortly before he was appointed as BBC chairman. So no surprise that we've had opposition politicians raising this with Rishi Sunak. We heard the head of the SNP at Westminster there challenging the Prime Minister about it. What we've now got is the appointments watchdog is going to have a look at the process that led up to the appointment of Richard Sharp as chairman of the BBC, and there's also going to be a BBC inquiry as well.
Ministers told other applicants not to waste their time applying. The appointment was to go to the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip's friend, the Tory donor. Even by the grubby standards of this government, it's all a bit banana republic.
As the honourable gentleman knows, there was a very robust process in place for the appointment of the chairman at the BBC, including a pre-appointment hearing. It was an incredibly robust process with an independent panel of 5 members that went through that process. And just to reassure the House, I understand that the Commissioner in Public Appointments is going to double-check that that went through, process was absolutely consistent with the proper governance expected of these appointments.
Before he appeared before the Select Committee, the candidate had to fill in a questionnaire, and he had to answer the question, do you currently or potentially have a business, financial or non-pecuniary interest or commitment that might give rise to the perception of a conflict of interest if you are appointed. Now, doesn't the Minister agree that helping to arrange an £800,000 loan for the person ultimately responsible for your appointment should have been declared in response to that question?
But the honourable gentleman is making a statement there about helping to arrange a loan. I don't know the basis on which he makes that assertion, but I know that all matters to do with any conflicts of interest or perception of conflicts of interest are going to be looked at by the BBC under that process established by the chairman.
With respect, the Minister is attempting to balance on the head of a pin with regard to Richard Sharp's involvement in the loan to the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister. He may not have provided advice, he may not have arranged it, but he clearly was involved in the introduction. And on that basis, should he not have made the declaration referred to by my honourable friend from Cardiff West when he appeared in front of the committee?
Obviously, Mr Sharp felt that that was not required. That was not the case. I understand that a process was put in place to separate him from the loan arrangements. And as I say, Mr Sharp has asked the Senior Non-Executive Director at the BBC to ensure that all matters in terms of disclosure were followed correctly.
I mean, Richard Sharp has always said, I was appointed on merit and merit alone. But we in the BBC also got a more personal response from him.
That's right. Everyone in the BBC got an email this week from the chairman, and he explained that before he was appointed chairman, he introduced an old friend of his and a distant cousin of the then Prime Minister, Sam Blythe, to the Cabinet Secretary, that's Simon Case, the head of the Civil Service, as Sam wanted to support Boris Johnson. And Richard Sharp wrote to all of us saying, I was not involved in making a loan or arranging a guarantee, and I did not arrange any financing. And he later went on to say, even now, I don't know any more than is reported in the media about a loan or reported guarantee. And as you say, Joe, he said, I have never hidden my long-standing relationship with the former Prime Minister. However, I believe firmly that I was appointed on merit.
Sean, we'll come back to you later on in the programme. Let's go over to Edinburgh now and talk to our Scottish political reporter, Jenny Davidson. Jenny, there's been controversy this week over the placing of a transgender rapist in a women's prison, particularly in light of the Scottish Government's recent gender recognition bill. What are the details?
That's right. So this is the case of a transgender woman called Isla Bryson, who's been found guilty of raping two women in 2016 and 2019 while she was still living as a man. In fact, she first appeared in court as a man and then announced she was transitioning to live as a woman. She was placed in Cornton Vale, which is a women's prison, although she was kept separate from the main prison population. And this was while she was being risk assessed for where to be placed long term. Concerns have been raised about that this week, and it was the subject of an urgent question in Parliament.
This scenario is exactly what I tried to stop during the passage of Nicola Sturgeon's Gender Recognition Reform Bill. But I was voted down by the narrowest of margins, and even with the flawed bill in limbo, violent criminals are exploiting the system and putting vulnerable women at risk. So can the Cabinet Secretary tell me why his SNP government think that any rapist should be allowed inside a women's prison?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill, had it not been stopped by another government completely wrongly, would not have changed the SPS's approach to trans prisoners, which is not dependent on the possession of a GRC. Possession of a gender recognition certificate will continue to have a minimal impact on how SPS manage transgender people. Their process is one based on the assessment of risk. I think that's the important thing to do. It's the assessment of risk. It's the assessment of risk for the individual, the assessment of risk for other prisoners, the assessment of risk for the prison staff as well. They have a tremendous track record in dealing with managing that risk. I would suggest they are far more expert in assessing that risk and dealing with it than any of us here in this chamber.
Now, as Keith Brown mentioned, decisions about where to house transgender prisoners made on a case-by-case basis by the SPS, the Scottish Prison Service. But questions being asked about why a rapist would be put in a female prison, even temporarily.
Jenny, there was more on this subject at First Minister's questions, wasn't there?
That's right. The Conservatives brought it up again then with Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross challenging Nicola Sturgeon on this situation. Now, she quoted the Chief Executive of Rape Crisis Scotland, who had said she didn't see how a rapist could be placed in a women's prison. Nicola Sturgeon said she agreed with that. And so Douglas Ross asked repeatedly for confirmation about whether Isla Bryson was still at that time in Cornton Vale. The First Minister clearly not wanting to give exact details about the location or the transfer of a prisoner, but she was making it clear that Isla Bryson would be moved out of Cornton Vale. And we understand that the First Minister, she said she didn't give formal direction to the Scottish Prison Service about this, but we understand she has made her views known to them.
Now, we have warned for months that violent criminals, just like the sex offender, the absolute beast we are discussing today, would try to exploit loopholes in the law and attack and traumatise women. The problem, as we have said all along, is not trans people. The problem is violent offenders. But now, before the SNP's GRR bill has even come into force, rapists are currently exploiting the current laws. We shouldn't make it any easier for them to attack women. Now, Nicola Sturgeon has seemed to reject that the fact that he's currently there isn't a risk to women. I can't agree with that.
The Scottish Prison Service is in the process of giving effect to the decision it has taken not to incarcerate this prisoner in Cornton Vale. And before the 72-hour period expires that Douglas Ross has referred to, my expectation is that this prisoner will not be in Cornton Vale Prison. There is no automatic right for any trans woman to serve their sentence in a female prison. That is subject to robust risk assessment. That is right and proper.
Now, this is actually all completely separate from the gender recognition reform bill that you mentioned earlier and we've been talking about so much in recent weeks, because actually the Scottish Prison Service assessment is based on how people identify to begin with, and then a risk assessment rather than any kind of gender recognition certificate. But it does play into all these arguments, because these are the kind of issues that were raised by people who were concerned about changes to that legislation.
Jenny, a new bill was passed that aims to put a stop to fox hunting. Can you give us the details of it?
Yeah, so the Hunting with Dogs bill is actually an update of another bill that was passed in 2002, the Protection of Wild Mammals Act, and that was a very controversial bill at that time. But this update is meant to close loopholes that have allowed illegal fox hunting to continue. This time round, probably broad consensus that an update was needed, but disagreement over licensing of exceptions with Labour and the Greens. The Greens, for the purposes of this bill, are opposition, concerned that exceptions were just putting loopholes back in, while the Conservatives more concerned that perhaps this would be unworkable for those such as farmers or people protecting wildlife who would need exceptions in certain circumstances.
I've talked about the need to ensure the highest standard of wild mammal welfare and about the need to engage to manage wildlife. These are not mutually exclusive. The bill has been designed to ensure that where it is necessary, the use of dogs to controlled wildlife is done in a manner that does not lead to unnecessary suffering.
If there is no hunting with dogs, predators will be left to attack other animals. Those predators, left unchecked, will attack livestock, like lambs and sheep, or ground-nesting birds, like the curlew or the capercaillie and other vulnerable species. This is not a simple bill that protects animal welfare. It's a bill that protects some animals' welfare at the expense of others.
Today was a chance to right this wrong, to scrap the loopholes being exploited, to end the cruelty of hunting with packs of dogs once and for all. But sadly, this bill does not do that. It won't close all the loopholes that exist. It won't end the use of packs of dogs. It merely licenses them. But, Presiding Officer, you cannot licence cruelty.
The bill is an improvement on what's currently in place. But will it stop fox hunting? Sadly, that remains to be seen. Despite the best efforts of the Scottish Greens and Labour to close the loopholes, the bill still contains many that are bound to be exploited by those who are determined to continue their cruel pastime.
Now, the bill was passed with support of all parties except the Conservatives, but as you can hear from that clip, there's still concerns, even with this revised version 21 years on, about whether the balance is right from one side or the other and whether they've actually closed all these loopholes.
Thank you, Jenny. Jenny Davidson there at Holyrood. Back to Westminster now. Sean, on Tuesday, we heard in the headlines, didn't we, the Immigration Minister admitted that 200 unaccompanied children who were housed in hotel accommodation by the Home Office had gone missing since July 2021. How did it happen?
Yes, well, this is what MPs wanted to find out. These reports emerged at the weekend that hundreds of children had gone missing from these hotels where the Home Office had been housing them. And just this week, following those reports, charities have written to the Prime Minister asking him to stop this practice. We're talking here about unaccompanied child migrants, and it would appear that hundreds have gone missing, and it's 200 who are still unaccounted for.
We've no power to detain unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in these settings, and we know some do go missing. Over 4,600 unaccompanied children have been accommodated in hotels since July 2021. There have been 440 missing occurrences, and 200 children remain missing, 13 of whom are under 16 years old, and only one is female.
The report from Sussex Police is that 1 in 4 unaccompanied children in a Home Office hotel have gone missing. 1 in 4. And around half of them are still missing. It would appear from the figures that he's given that this means one hotel accounts for 40% of the missing children. And a whistleblower has said, is reported to have said, children are literally being picked up from outside the building, disappearing and not being found. They are being taken from the street by traffickers. This is a total dereliction of duty that is putting children at risk. We need an urgent and serious action to crack down on these gangs and to keep children and young people safe.
I'm afraid that the statistics that the Right Honourable Lady quotes are not those that I've been given by the Home Office. With regard to the press reports that individuals have been abducted from outside the hotel, well, those are very serious allegations, and I've specifically asked the officials who run this hotel whether they've seen evidence of that, and indeed I asked the senior leadership of Brighton and Hove Council. I've not been presented with evidence that that has happened, but I will continue to make inquiries.
Just last year, Sussex Police pursued a car that had collected 2 children from outside this hotel. When they managed to get the car to safety, they released 2 child migrants and they arrested one of the members who was driving it, who was a gang leader who was there to coerce the children into crime.
Does he agree with me that the best way to safeguard these children is to prevent them crossing in the first place? Does he agree with me that it's very, very concerning and actually shameful that opposition members stand up in here having failed to back the legislation that would do that, that will enable us furthermore to actually test the age of these children? Does he agree with me that it's absolutely vital that we know that these are in fact children and not dangerous criminals? So does he agree with me and hope very much that the next time that he brings forward legislation that we will strengthen our sovereign borders as we as a country have a right to do?
The opposition continually oppose any effort by us to strengthen our borders. We will be bringing forward further legislation, and we are, as she knows, reviewing whether we can adopt a more scientific approach to the verification of ages, as is done by a number of our European counterparts. It's absolutely right that we do that, because any adult who poses as a child coming into this country poses a serious risk to the young people who they then live alongside, whether these in these hotels or any other setting.
Robert Jenrick there. On a completely different subject, Sean, there's been an admission from the UK government that figuring out the budget for the Northern Ireland Assembly, because there isn't power sharing at the moment, will be very difficult as the Northern Ireland Budget Bill was introduced on Monday. Why?
Yes, so this is a very difficult situation. What's happening is that legislation to allow the UK government here at Westminster to set the budgets for 9 departments in Northern Ireland, that is being fast-tracked through Parliament, in part because those departments haven't had a proper budget since last April because of the collapse of the power sharing arrangements. So there isn't an executive and there isn't an assembly. We're not getting reports from Stormont in this programme. No. And so this was a warning, really, from a Northern Ireland minister, Steve Baker. He wanted the politicians in Northern Ireland to play a bigger role, but he also gave this warning that things were going to be very, very tough.
This bill is essential to deliver spending for Northern Ireland departments within the budget limits which have been set. This is not going to be an easy task, and it's going to be a task taking place in difficult circumstances. People in Northern Ireland rightly expect to see decisions taken in Stormont, and I agree with them. Once again, I would state my continued disappointment that it's necessary for the government to step in and legislate for this budget, and I would once again urge the Northern Ireland parties to find a way through back to forming that government.
We are reluctantly supporting this bill, but it is right to highlight the real-world effects these allocations will have. I hope the Secretary of State will arrange a meeting to discuss these concerns that school leaders have. The health service in Northern Ireland will also require more long-term thinking than is possible with this budget.
In over 300 areas of law, the way that we administer, for example, our ability to trade with the rest of the United Kingdom, is now determined by a foreign polity, the European Union, that imposes laws on Northern Ireland into which we have no say. There is no scrutiny. There is no accountability for those laws. So the democratic deficit in Northern Ireland is something that's very real to the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive, and is one of the fundamental reasons why, Madam Deputy Speaker, we don't have functioning political institutions, because this party is not prepared to tolerate a situation where we are treated like an EU colony.
You know, it's like a Pontius Pilate concert in here today. Nothing to do with us. Hands are being washed all over the place. The reality is, a budget has been set by the Conservative Party, who have absolutely no support in Northern Ireland, because the DUP won't go into government. They could go into government tomorrow morning if they wanted to. And the Minister, a man who I often agree with, made a very clear point about this. There is no connection whatsoever between the negotiations that are going on between the European Commission and the British Government and the formation of a government in Northern Ireland to deal with the problems that we face. And anybody who says otherwise is lying to themselves.
In terms of the way forward, we want to see a pragmatic solution. I fear that if we turn this into a constitutional test, we're not going to find a way forward. But for us, the key issue here is maintaining the dual market access to both the wider UK market and to the European Union market.
I think as we approach the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, as we approach hopefully getting a deal on the protocol, and therefore approach restoring the executive, I think it is incumbent on all of us in our different and respective positions to work out how to better serve the people of Northern Ireland and deliver not only a budget that works for them, but transformed public services so that Northern Ireland can be a real beacon for the whole UK.
Sean, thank you for now. We're going to speak to our political reporter in Wales, Daniel Davies. Daniel, you're at the Senedd. Welsh Rugby has been rocked by allegations of sexism this week. How has the Welsh Government responded?
Ministers have increased the pressure on the Welsh Rugby Union after a BBC Wales Investigates documentary. That programme revealed the testimony of former employees who had been, they said, the victims of sexism. There were allegations about the use of racist language in the workplace and claims that the Welsh Rugby Union hadn't dealt with those complaints properly at the time. Now, the Sports Minister met with rugby bosses earlier in the week, and since then, Senedd members have wanted to know what came of that meeting, and there have been questions to the Social Justice Minister as well.
Minister, while I accept that dealing with the issue raised in the BBC programme are a matter for WRU, we have to make it clear that such behaviour has no place in today's Wales. Will you, as a Minister for Equalities, be meeting with WRU to underline the fact that sexism and misogyny are not to be tolerated in any workplace, especially in such a high-profile one like WRU?
I was, just thinking again of the impact on those the courage of the women who came forward. Such courage to take after experiencing the harassment, the bullying, the abuse. But I have to say what came over was serious, I would say, institutional misogyny and sexism, which obviously imbued the organisation. Now, this is something which, of course, the Deputy Minister for Arts and Sports is engaging with. We fed back yesterday. She'd already met with WRU on the immediate actions it must take.
The First Minister, Mark Drakeford, has said that the WRU needs to take urgent and transparent action, including publicly acknowledging the scale and the nature of this issue. Some opposition members have called for the chief executive of the rugby union to stand down. The union says it'll call in an external task force to investigate these matters and make sure its working culture, its working practices are up to scratch. Meanwhile, we're waiting to hear whether a Senedd committee will launch an inquiry. There are certainly some people who say that they should do.
Daniel, waiting times in the NHS in Wales have been increasing enormously, and First Minister Mark Drakeford is being blamed, isn't he?
Yes, at question time this week, the leaders of all the opposition parties rounded on him, on his government's record on the NHS. There were questions about ambulance response times, waiting times for operations, the state of some NHS buildings. The leader of Plaid Cymru says that in Westminster, Keir Starmer has acknowledged that the situation in the English NHS amounts to a crisis. Well, why is it then, says Mr Price, that Mark Drakeford won't admit that the same thing is happening in Wales?
Labour in Scotland has described the situation in the NHS as being in a state of crisis there also. Why is it that you, as a party, are prepared to declare the NHS to be in crisis everywhere else, apart from here in Wales, where you have responsibility and have done so for over 25 years?
The service is under enormous pressure. There are more people working in it than ever before. There is more money invested in it than ever before. And despite all the additional things it has to deal with, COVID, flu, strep A, strikes, the service manages every single day to reach thousands and thousands of people who, if the health service wasn't there, would never have access to the services that they need. If he wants to describe it as a crisis and thinks that somehow a psychodrama solution is what the health service needs, it's not the view that I take of it.
Now, all that happened on the day that Plaid Cymru published its 5-point plan for the NHS, and despite the disagreement between the two leaders, Mark Drakeford said he would look at those proposals. It won't surprise him to find that at the top of the list is a demand that NHS workers be paid higher wages. The Welsh Government says it simply can't afford to go beyond an offer of a one-off payment to NHS staff this year, but so far unions have turned down that offer, and it seems that we are set for more strikes, including the February the 6th, which will be the first time we've seen nurses and ambulance workers on strike on the same day in Wales.
Now, hundreds of jobs are at risk at a food processing plant in Anglesey. No doubt worrying news for all the workers there. What can the Welsh Government do about it?
Yes, this is the news that a company called Two Sisters is considering closing a chicken factory in Llangefni, so 730 jobs are at risk there. And members of the Senedd were told that that decision could come in short order, possibly before the start of the financial year in April, which leaves very little time to find alternative work for the people involved. And the local Senedd member for Ynys Môn, Rhun Iorwerth, said that he has concerns about the future of the island's economy.
I will not accept the fate of Ynys Môn being just a holiday and retirement island, and that's not to knock tourism, which has a very important role to play, but a community totally reliant on that ceases to operate like a normal community. But at the heart of this are the people, my constituents, facing losing their work in the midst of a cost of living crisis. So will Welsh Government give that undertaking to support the workers and our community at this time in every way, to provide support for families that will need it, support for the council, to deal with added pressure on services?
There's a great future on the island, but you can't pretend that work is going to be available at the start of April, or indeed that the workforce that work at Two Sisters are going to be able to take up all of those jobs. There'll be a need to think about the training and the skills requirements to actually think about all the different jobs that are available. So I'm afraid that the ability to backfill 700 plus jobs in this sector in a matter of weeks isn't something, to be honest, for me to claim that I could do.
The company's given various reasons for closing this site, including that it's a small site and it can carry out its processes more efficiently elsewhere. But while we wait for confirmation, the Welsh and the UK governments have said that they will respond to help people.
Daniel, thank you very much. Daniel Davis, our reporter there at the Senedd. Sean, the issue of gay marriage in churches, Church of England, evoked strong feelings in the House this week as bishops in the Church of England refused to back a change in teaching that would have allowed priests to marry same-sex couples. What was said?
Yes, very emotional exchanges here. The Church of England has got a big decision coming up, but as you say, prior to that, bishops have basically said they're not going to change their stance, although priests will be allowed to bless same-sex unions after a civil ceremony has taken place. A rather unusual situation as far as Parliament's concerned, because this isn't really a matter for ministers, but there is an MP who answers questions on behalf of the Church of England. He represents the Church Commissioners, and so MPs did have the opportunity to raise this and express their feelings.
Last Friday, the bishops of the Church of England published a pastoral letter and draft resources that will enable same-sex couples to come to a Church of England church to give thanks for their civil marriage or civil partnership and to have a service in which there will be prayers of dedication, thanksgiving and blessing for the couple. The bishops also apologise for the rejection, exclusion and hostility which LGBTQI+ people have faced in some of our churches. The bishops are united in condemning homophobia and urge churches to welcome same-sex couples unreservedly and joyfully.
Imagine being a church warden. You turn up every day of the week maybe to open the church before the priest gets there to do the 8 o'clock. On Sundays, you turn up a couple of hours beforehand to make sure that the church is warm. You clean the vestments, you iron them, you make sure that the church is prepared, and you make sure there's enough. You count the collection at the end of the service, and you've fallen in love with somebody from your own sex. And the place that you've devoted your life to, and your God, is that church, and that's the place where you can't get married. That's terribly, terribly painful. And I think there's still a cruelty in what the bishops have brought forward. And is there any biblical teaching that says that this is wrong? Any? Really? Did Jesus say a single word about same-sex relationships or marriage? I don't think he did. He said a great deal about love, a God of love. And St. Paul said that in Christ there was neither male nor female, neither Jew nor Greek. And I think you would probably also say neither gay nor straight.
In a sense, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Church of England, if it will forgive me for saying this, has almost managed to upset absolutely everyone, because these proposals clearly do not go far enough for some. And actually, I would just ask the House to understand there are some who are deeply grieving and troubled because they believe they've gone too far.
There are many here and outside this House who've invested a great deal in promoting freedom of religion or belief across the world and challenging abuses of it. And we cannot do that in all conscience in other countries if we do not also honour freedom of religion or belief at home.
Nothing made it harder for me to come out as a gay Anglican than the Church's teaching on sexual orientation and human sexuality. And in the end, I made the choice that I think many young gay Anglicans did, of choosing to be myself and choosing not to go to church. And that is such a tragedy for so many, particularly young Anglicans across our country. And I fear that the prayers that have been proposed by the bishops, however beautiful, do not go far enough to bridging that divide and closing that distance between Christians and their God.
A very emotional and personal debate. Thank you very much, Sean. That's all we have time for Politics UK for this week. I'll be back with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Bye-bye.